When you truly begin to love yourself, you stop looking for someone to fill an emotional gap or rescue you from loneliness. Instead of entering relationships from a place of lack or neediness, you approach them from a place of abundance and inner stability. Self-love is the foundation for emotional independence. It teaches you that your worth isn't dependent on external validation or another person's presence in your life. Rather than searching for someone to complete you, you realize that you are already complete. This shift in mindset transforms your relationships from codependency into healthy interdependence. You're no longer trying to mold yourself to be who someone else wants. You become someone who attracts what is aligned with who you are. The right person is not drawn to your emptiness, but to the fullness you carry within. When you feel whole, you radiate a sense of peace and self-respect that naturally draws others who are also grounded, secure, and emotionally mature. This inner wholeness reshapes your standards and the way you engage with love. You stop confusing intensity with intimacy or attention with affection. Instead, you begin to recognize and value the deeper qualities in a partner that reflect your own inner growth and self-awareness. When you love yourself, confidence stops being a performance and becomes your natural state of being. You no longer seek approval in every interaction or try to shrink yourself to be more likable. Instead, you carry yourself with quiet assurance, knowing your value isn't up for negotiation. This kind of confidence isn't loud or arrogant. It's grounded, calm, and deeply attractive. People are naturally drawn to those who are comfortable in their own skin. There's something unmistakably compelling about someone who walks into a room without needing to be the center of attention, but still commands respect simply by being fully present. This energy doesn't come from pretending to be better than others. It comes from a deep relationship with yourself and knowing that you're enough as you are. When you radiate self-assurance, you stop over-explaining your worth or trying to convince others to see it. You no longer chase love or try to prove you're deserving of it. This shift draws people who value authenticity, who are emotionally available, and who aren't threatened by your strength. You naturally filter out those who are drawn to insecurity or who try to manipulate it, because your energy no longer aligns with desperation or self-doubt. Confidence rooted in self-love also allows you to show up in relationships without masks or filters. You're not afraid to express your needs or desires because you no longer believe they make you too much. You embrace your individuality instead of hiding it, which makes your connections richer, more real, and built on mutual respect rather than performance or pretense. When you love yourself, you begin to understand that boundaries aren't walls meant to shut others out. They are bridges to protect your peace, energy, and emotional well-being. You stop tolerating behavior that drains or disrespects you, not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. Self-love teaches you that saying a no doesn't make you difficult. It makes you clear about what you will and won't accept. Without self-love, it's easy to confuse tolerance with patience or sacrifice with love. You might let things slide just to keep the peace, avoid being alone, or out of fear of seeming selfish. But when you begin to value yourself, your boundaries become less about protecting yourself from others and more about honoring your own truth. You stop abandoning yourself to keep others comfortable, and you start standing up for what feels right in your body, your heart, and your mind. This clarity doesn't come from resentment, it comes from alignment. You know what you need, and you're no longer afraid to communicate it. You're willing to lose a connection that isn't respectful, rather than lose yourself trying to hold it together. You no longer chase after people who confuse inconsistency for passion or drama for depth, because your boundaries naturally repel relationships built on chaos or control. With stronger boundaries, you become a mirror for others to either rise or fall. People who are not ready to meet you with mutual respect will step away, not because you're unkind, but because your clarity makes it impossible for them to take advantage of your kindness. And the ones who stay are often those who are drawn to your strength, your emotional maturity, and your unwavering sense of self. When you cultivate a strong sense of self-love, your tolerance for disrespect, emotional games, and inconsistency begins to dissolve. You no longer see red flags as puzzles to solve or flaws to excuse. You see them for what they are: warnings. This isn't because you've become cold or overly cautious, but because you've learned, often through painful experience, that peace is more valuable than potential, and that love should never cost your dignity or your emotional health. Self-love sharpens your emotional awareness. When you're grounded in your own worth, you trust your instincts instead of silencing them to protect someone else's image. You stop second-guessing yourself every time something feels off. You no longer talk yourself into staying in situations that cause confusion, anxiety, or emotional chaos just because someone shows flashes of affection or apologizes after crossing a line. You've been through enough to know that inconsistency is not a character quirk, it's often a pattern. And now you're finally listening to your gut instead of arguing with it. This shift doesn't make you judgmental, it makes you discerning. When you love yourself, your standards become clearer, not because you're holding out for perfection, but because you're no longer willing to betray yourself for the illusion of connection. You can recognize manipulative charm, emotional unavailability, or subtle disrespect much faster because you've done the inner work to know what real connection feels like and what it doesn't. You've sat with yourself long enough to understand that love doesn't look like confusion, manipulation, or silence after conflict. It looks like safety, consistency, and mutual care. People often ignore red flags not because they don't see them, but because they're afraid of being alone or starting over. But self-love replaces that fear with a kind of inner security that says, I would rather be alone than poorly loved. You become less willing to entertain temporary comfort that comes at the cost of long-term peace. This changes everything. You're no longer impressed by grand gestures if they're not backed by genuine consistency. You're not seduced by words unless they're followed by actions. You begin to value the quiet presence of someone who listens and respects your boundaries more than the loud excitement of someone who only shows up when it's convenient. Self-love also allows you to acknowledge your own patterns with compassion. You begin to reflect on the times you ignored warning signs, and instead of blaming yourself, you learn from them. You stop romanticizing emotional unavailability or seeing dysfunction as a challenge to fix. You recognize that being needed is not the same as being loved. And with that clarity, you become less likely to confuse intensity with intimacy or chaos with chemistry. What once felt thrilling now feels exhausting, and what once felt boring, like consistency and emotional maturity, now feels deeply attractive. When someone new enters your life, your self-awareness gives you a kind of emotional radar. You start asking different questions. Not a do they like me, but a do I feel safe with them, and are they consistent with their words and actions? You pay attention to how they handle conflict, how they treat people they don't need, how they respond to your boundaries. You're no longer looking through a lens of fantasy or future potential. You're grounded in the present, evaluating what is actually being shown to you. Because you've built a solid relationship with yourself, you can observe without becoming overly attached. You don't rush to define the relationship or abandon your standards just to be chosen. You've learned that it's not your job to prove your worth to someone, it's your job to protect your peace. And that means walking away when something doesn't feel aligned, no matter how much you wanted it to be right. Loving yourself shifts the way you choose who gets access to you. It changes what you're willing to tolerate, what you define as love, and how deeply you're willing to betray yourself just to be with someone. When self-love becomes part of your foundation, the bar doesn't go higher in terms of superficial standards. It deepens in terms of alignment, values, respect, and emotional presence. You stop choosing people based on potential surface charm or timing. You start choosing based on truth. Before self-love takes root, settling often looks like rationalizing behavior that doesn't feel good, shrinking yourself to be easier to love, or staying in relationships that are familiar but unfulfilling. There's a quiet ache that comes with convincing yourself day after day that what you're experiencing is a normal or enough. You ignore the lack of emotional availability, the mismatched values, the inconsistent effort, and instead tell yourself to be grateful you're not alone. But loving yourself changes the story. You no longer see loneliness as a reason to compromise. You see it as a space to protect your standards until something true arrives. Self-love creates a sense of emotional security that makes settling feel intolerable. You know how much you've grown, how many times you've stitched yourself back together after being broken by someone who never truly saw you. That kind of healing doesn't leave you desperate. It leaves you aware. You understand that being with someone who doesn't meet you with emotional depth, respect, and real presence will always cost more than being alone. It costs your time, your energy, your peace, and eventually your sense of self. You stop falling for relationships that look good on paper, feel hollow in real life. You're no longer impressed by external markers, status, looks, or curated charm when they aren't matched by character, consistency, and emotional safety. You recognize that compatibility isn't about shared hobbies or surface chemistry. It's about how two people support each other's growth, how conflict is handled, and how deeply both people show up when things aren't easy. Self-love makes you more selective, not because you're picky or difficult, but because you know the cost of choosing the wrong person. You know what it feels like to wake up next to someone and still feel alone. You know how exhausting it is to be with someone who doesn't fully show up, who makes you question your worth, who asks for more than they're willing to give. That memory sits quietly inside you, shaping your discernment. So now, when someone enters your life who doesn't match your energy, your vision, or your values, you don't cling, you let go. The most powerful shift is internal. You stop hoping someone will change. You stop romanticizing struggle as a necessary path to love. You stop believing that almost is good enough. Self-love helps you accept people for who they are, not for who you wish they could be. And with that acceptance comes the freedom to walk away when it's clear that the connection isn't aligned. Not out of anger, not out of bitterness, but out of a quiet knowing that you deserve more. When you stop settling, you also stop negotiating your non-negotiables. You no longer minimize your needs to appear easygoing or ignore your intuition just to keep the peace. You stop saying it's fine is when it's not. You speak up, not because you're trying to control anyone, but because you're honoring your own truth. You've learned that anyone who makes you feel like your standards are too high is only revealing they're not prepared to meet them. You also become more patient. You're not in a rush to be chosen, because you've already chosen yourself. You know that something real and aligned will never require you to betray your own boundaries, self-worth, or vision for your life. You're willing to wait for a connection that feels like peace, not pressure, because now you've stopped treating love as something you have to earn and started treating it as something that should meet you where you already are. When you begin to love yourself deeply, the energy you carry into the world changes. You're no longer unconsciously broadcasting fear, insecurity, or unworthiness. Instead, you're radiating calm, respect, and emotional openness. You become a living example of the kind of love you're hoping to receive, not by pretending or performing, but by genuinely embodying the values you hold close. The way you treat yourself becomes a silent message to others. This is how I expect to be treated. If you want someone who communicates honestly, you start by being honest with yourself. If you want someone who's emotionally available, you begin by showing up for your own feelings, even the uncomfortable ones. 1. If you want loyalty, respect, kindness, and depth, you practice those same traits in your relationship with yourself first. You don't just talk about your standards, you live them. And when that becomes your baseline, you naturally start to attract people who either match that energy or fall away because they can't. This doesn't mean you become perfect or emotionless. It means you become emotionally responsible. You're no longer demanding from others what you refuse to give yourself. You stop expecting someone else to fix your wounds, fill your emptiness, or define your worth. You've done enough inner work to realize that the relationship you have with yourself sets the tone for every other connection you build. You stop chasing validation and start embodying self-respect. People are drawn to what feels familiar. When you carry unresolved wounds or a lack of self-worth, you often attract relationships that reinforce those same patterns. But when you begin to operate from a healed, self-loving space, your entire frequency shifts. You're no longer magnetized to chaos or intensity disguised as passion. You're pulled toward clarity, depth, and peace because that's what now feels familiar. You've reconditioned your nervous system to see safety, not drama, as love. This internal alignment allows you to love from a place of wholeness rather than fear. You're not entering relationships to be completed, saved, or rescued. You're looking for someone to build with, not someone to fix. You're seeking mutual expansion, not emotional dependence. This distinction is powerful because it eliminates the power struggles and unspoken expectations that often sabotage relationships. Instead of projecting your unmet needs onto someone else, you take ownership of your emotional world and invite someone in, not to rescue you, but to walk alongside you. When you reflect what you want to receive, your standards become self-evident. You don't need to announce them loudly or guard them fiercely. They're woven into how you carry yourself. You communicate directly, you take responsibility for your own triggers, and you know how to give space without creating distance. That emotional maturity becomes a filter in itself. The right people, those who are emotionally ready and self-aware, will resonate with that energy. Others won't, and that's no longer something you feel the need to fix. This way of living also changes how you experience rejection and loss. When you're grounded in self-love, someone walking away or not choosing you doesn't destroy your sense of value. You don't internalize it as a sign that you're unworthy. You recognize it as misalignment. You trust that what's meant for you will arrive without manipulation or emotional sacrifice. You stop trying to force connections and start allowing them to unfold naturally, trusting your intuition to guide you toward what feels true. You reflect what you want to receive by staying committed to your inner peace. You choose to speak kindly to yourself even when you're struggling. You practice compassion, not perfection. You show up for your healing, for your boundaries, and for your growth because you know that real love can only meet you as deeply as you've met yourself. You start showing up as the partner you hope to attract, not because you're trying to impress anyone, but because it's who you've become through your own journey inward, see.